Hello and welcome. I'm Chris Braitch, and this is the Seen and Heard podcast, a conversational series. I am an emotional health and leadership coach and co-founder of the not-for-profit Seen and Heard, which supports those seeking healing, connection, and systemic change. My vision is to move myself and the world around me towards connection and compassion. And each week, I will connect with amazing guests who are on their journey to bring about meaningful change in their own lives and the world around them. Thanks for being here. Let's get started. Welcome everybody to the Seen and Heard podcast, a conversational series. I have the great pleasure today of being joined by Richard Scorer. Richard began his legal career as a trainee solicitor in 1992 and qualified as a solicitor in 1994. He is highly experienced in personal injury law and human rights law, and with specialist expertise in representing victims and survivors of abuse across the UK. He's been described as one of Britain's leading specialists in the field of abuse law. Over the course of his career, Richard has acted for hundreds of victims and survivors of abuse in a wide range of settings, including schools, churches, sports clubs, youth clubs, hospitals, military and overseas institutions. He has particular expertise in cases involving religious organisations, including the Catholic Church, Church of England, Jehovah's Witnesses, and Islamic institutions such as mosques and madrasas. He also represents many young women and men affected by child exploitation across the country, having acted for victims in many of the major cases, and he acts for numerous victims of abuse with learning difficulties. In addition, Richard specialises in public inquiries. He represented over 100 victims and survivors in the Independent Inquiry into Child Sex Abuse, ICSA, and bereaved families in the Manchester Arena bombing inquiry. He is currently representing families of victims in the Thirlwall Public Inquiry and the crimes of Lucy Letby. Welcome, Richard.
Well, hello. Really good to be here.
Yeah, it's fantastic to connect. I usually sort of mention kind of how we know each other and things like that, but Richard's been one of our legal ambassadors at Seen and Heard since the very start. So since we got going and no one had returned a phone call, no one knew who you were. Richard and Slater and Gordon became ambassadors really early and have helped us through. And I've always appreciated your honesty, your energy and your care in this area. So thank you, Richard.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's been really good to work with you, and I think the work you're doing is fantastic. And, I will probably come on to this later, but I think institutions, really need to reach out to you and to the work that you're doing, because I think you can teach them a lot.
No, I do appreciate that. Yeah, we'll definitely come on to that, because I think, there's a few really good institutions out there and they're starting to lay down some solid best practice. Sadly, the majority a little bit slow to catch up with that. So, yeah. But I love to start a podcast by knowing a little bit more about the person that I'm speaking to. Excuse me. I'd love to hear a bit more about your early years, your journey, and kind of what brought you to the work you now do.
So I think my early years probably have got a big influence on the fact that I've ended up doing this sort of work. Brief biography. I was born and grew up in South London. My dad was sort of a bit posser than my mum. He'd been to boarding school. I'll come back to that point. My mum's Australian, very down to earth. Quite emotionally warm and open person. Contrast in some ways. They were both, I suppose, politically quite left wing. So I was probably brought up with quite a strong sense of social justice, and probably quite a strong scepticism of institutions and institutional power, and sort of recognising the need sometimes to challenge that. Both my parents were quite atheist, quite strongly opposed to religion. I'm not sort of anti-religious, but I do have my issues around organised religion, particularly because of the work that I've done. So those influences were kind of probably there from the start, and probably have influenced where I've ended up. In terms of sort of childhood, I suppose, and I mention this because I think it has informed the work that I've done. Probably the biggest thing that happened to me as a child was losing my brother to cancer. That happened when I was 5. He was 6. We were very close. So obviously that was hugely traumatic, and I think to some extent, cast a shadow over parts of my childhood, and I think it probably has given me a bit of a kind of abiding interest in childhood trauma and how children process trauma, and the fact that it can take a very long time to process trauma. I mean, in the work that I do now, I've never found it difficult to understand why people can go through abuse, for example, at a boarding school when they're young, and then still not have been able to process it decades later. I get that, and I think that sort of part of my childhood probably has been influential in that.
Mm-hmm.
But I was also, I think, lucky growing up in many ways. I mean, I don't mean particularly in a financial sense, but I'm glad that I avoided a boarding school education. I'll be honest about it. And my dad had been to boarding school, and I'd been to Repton, and his brothers had been to Repton, and their father and grandfather and uncles and all of that, and that was the kind of family thing that people did in his family. And because I think he sort of had rebelled a bit against that, and because of his politics, he was like, "You're going to go to the local comprehensive," and that's what I ended up doing. And I think I remember, some of my friends being taken out of the state system and being sent to prep school and then sent to boarding school, and I kept up with them and I don't think any of them had a particularly positive experience of it. And we tend to think of boarding school, we tend to associate, the public associate boarding schools with great privilege and the kind of British class structure and the power that some people have. And of course, all of those things are there. But I think for many of the children who go through it, it's it has been in the past at least, a pretty negative experience. And that seemed to be the case for children, friends that I had who were taken out and sent to boarding school. So I kind of consider myself lucky that that I escaped that my dad kind of rebelled against the family tradition there.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. Thank you so much for sharing. Then, yeah, what was your brother's name?
Jason.
Jason. Yeah. Bless you. Thank you for sharing that, and my heart is with you.
Thank you.
That's it was so traumatic, losing a sibling. So thank you, and then hearing mum and dad, the kind of the politics, dad rebelling against his I guess in a way breaking the cycle of just sending people away. So hearing that, and the strong sense of social justice and institutional sort of a bit of a wariness around institutions of any kind, whether it be organised religion, whether it be things. I can really see how that shaped your journey, and I think I probably have a similar concern that any sort of power structure, by its definition, always serves itself first. And unless there's some real compassionate leadership going on in there, and the staff, the culture has really reprogrammed itself. And there are some companies and institutions doing amazing stuff out there, but they've had to fight against being an institution to kind of be a good one. Do you have a take on that?
Well, we may come back to this later when we're talking about ICSA and mandatory reporting, but I think that, my experience over the work that I've done is that, you're absolutely right, power can corrupt. It doesn't always, but it can do, and we have to have accountability for power. I think when we're talking about abuse and the cover-up abuse that I've seen on so many cases, I think that has been at its worst in institutions that rely for their survival and for their success on reputation. So, and boarding schools are obviously a case in point, because they have to have a good reputation in order for parents to decide to spend money, sending their children to them. So reputation is important to them. Religious organisations, in the same way, they want us to believe that they are, full of good people, that they do good things, that they're a moral beacon in society. So reputation is important. And I think that the worst cover-ups tend to happen in settings where there is that strong dynamic towards reputational protection, because reputation is so crucial to the institution's survival and its overall success. So that's my kind of kind of take on it, and obviously there are kind of lots of nuances around that. But if there's a sort of central reason why I've long been in favour of mandatory reporting, it's because I can see, and I have seen in so many cases, that the desire to protect institutional reputation is often done at the expense of children.
Richard, that's so. I've not heard it put so clearly, but I'm casting my way back through those, and I'm thinking, Savile, I'm thinking Scouts, I'm thinking church, I'm thinking schools, I'm thinking, children's care homes. It's like, God, yeah, they had to appear, white, shiny beacons, and therefore, this stuff just can't get out. Just can't get out. Otherwise, we're done. We're sunk, and the whole thing starts to fall. The house of cards comes down. Yeah.
What we want in society is for people to, because child abuse can happen anywhere. It does happen in all sorts of places, and what we want is a culture where, people, organisations, institutions actually kind of benefit reputationally from being open and honest about it. That's where we need to get to, because then they could stop it sooner. And some of the things that we've, the terrible cover-ups that we've seen would be stopped much sooner.
Thank you. Yeah, let's talk a bit about that, because we're on it. And if I dodge around too much, well, many people listening won't know what mandatory reporting is. So there's a lot of depth around it, but just on the surface, what is it and why do we need it?
So to summarise it briefly, a mandatory reporting law is a law that requires people who work with children, principally professionals who work with children, teachers, priests, youth workers, and so on, that requires them as a matter of law to report knowledge or suspicion of abuse, and requires them so that there will be a criminal penalty if they don't. That's sort of the classic mandatory reporting law. And we don't have that certainly in England and Wales at the moment. We need to have it. Most countries around the world do have it. Even if you look at less developed countries, many of them have mandatory reporting laws, and they're often not particularly strongly enforced. But most countries have mandatory reporting. And if you went out into the street and said to people, "Do you think that there's a legal obligation in this country to report abuse?" Most people would say, "Of course there is." I've heard people say that many times. There actually isn't. Right now, sitting here as we are in the UK in 2026, it is entirely lawful for a teacher, for example, to know that a pupil has been raped and to do nothing about it, not to report it. Entirely lawful for them not to report it. Now, there may be kind of professional protocols and so on that say that they should report it, but there is no law that requires that. And that, in my view, is what we have to change. We've seen so many cases where abuse has been swept under the carpet, has been covered up in institutional settings because, for reasons of reputational protection and other reasons, people just didn't report what they knew, or actually more frequently what they suspected, what they strongly suspected, because often people don't know for certain that abuse is happening, but they do have a kind of strong suspicion. And that's what we need to ensure, that those things are reported so that they can be investigated and abusers can be stopped.
Yeah, thank you very much, Richard. I'll circle back with kind of the difference between mandatory reporting and effective mandatory reporting, because I think we don't have to get too lost in the weeds to see the difference. But just to highlight for those listening, the ones that always jump to mind for me, the kind of really high profile ones, the Catholic Church sending offending priests out to the States. The classic one, set out to Boston, out to Chicago, and the majority of them went on to, of course, reoffend in another country. And then within the boarding school world, it was now widespread that we know that if someone was caught offending or suspected to be offending by the management of the school, they would likely be put out to pasture with a good reference to another school, sort of sweep the problem under the rug, make it go away, maybe somewhere a bit quieter, keep them out of trouble, that sort of stuff. God forbid, don't let the governors, the parents and the press know. And we know, of course, they went on to abuse. So that's happened all across, whether it's care homes, whether it's, and I'm not saying these are exclusive, but many people have heard of those. Any comments on that, or any that where people have very proactively been passed around, offenders have been passed around?
I mean, I lose count of the number of cases where that kind of thing happened, and the boarding school sector was particularly prone to that. Catholic Church. I mean, I'll come on a minute to talk about how I got into this work, but the very first Catholic Church case I did involved exactly that. And if you go back to the 1970s and 1980s, particularly, that was a great time to be a child abuser, to be honest. A great time to be a paedophile, because you could get into institutions very easily. There was no vetting, and then once you were discovered, and you often were discovered at some point, then you could, as you say, leave with a good reference and move on elsewhere. And I think that it's harder now because we have vetting and we have more societal awareness of abuse, but we shouldn't be under any illusion that kind of thing, can't happen. It can happen now, and it does happen now. And actually, some of the cases that ICSA looked at, were pretty recent, within things that have happened in the last few years. And I mean, one of the things here is that people, if you go out into the street and say to people, if you discovered child abuse going on in an institution where you're working, would you report it? Everybody, of course, says, yes, I would report it. Of course you would. And that's what we all think. We all think that's what we would do, quite understandably. All of the evidence suggests that people don't report it. And that's because of pressures that people come under. It's because because often they're looking at suspicions of abuse rather than certain knowledge. They don't want to risk falsely accusing somebody, a colleague. They don't want to risk something that would damage the institution that employs them. So all of these pressures operate to discourage people from reporting abuse, and that's what tends to happen. And that, going back to our last question, that's why we need that mandatory reporting law.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I hear you. I think a person morally can feel very connected that this is the right thing to do, but then suddenly all those other pressures start weighing in, financial security, reputational risk, if I get it wrong. And so for effective mandatory reporting to be in place, we're talking about a criminal sanction. We're talking about protection for whistleblowers, so protection for people who come forward. What's another sort of tenet of effective mandatory reporting?
Well, I think a key part of this is requiring people to report reasonable suspicion of abuse.
Correct.
And it's really important that people understand that children generally don't disclose abuse, and abuse is not witnessed. So a lot of the situations that ICSA looked at where abuse was suspected within institutions, that's exactly what it was. It was suspicion. Staff had suspicion that something wasn't right, and those cases are actually the vast majority of the situations that happen in institutional settings where an abuser is operating and other people have concerns or suspicions, but they tell themselves that maybe somebody else will report it, or maybe they don't want to falsely accuse anybody. So it's those the situations that actually form the vast majority of situations that we have, and those are the situations that any law has to capture. And it's not straightforward to do that, but you do have to, if you're going to have an effective mandatory reporting law, you do have to capture reasonable suspicion of abuse. One of the problems with the law that the government is trying to introduce at the moment is it completely ignores all of that. The law only relates to abuse which is, definitely known about, or witnessed, or the child discloses, and those situations are actually quite rare.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm really hearing those sort of importance of the effective side of things. And I think, ultimately, like you say, for it to be witnessed, very, very unlikely. For a child to disclose, very unlikely. And we found within ICSA that it was 25 plus years on average for people to disclose child sexual abuse. And there's a lot of a coming to term process that happens. So, realistically, the reports that are out there are the tip of the iceberg. Only 1 in 9 people who are sexually abused ever report. So even what we're seeing now, which is a big uptick in people talking about it, thankfully, a more trauma-informed society, you're starting to hear this stuff finally. Lots of scandals everywhere. If it's not blood, it's Harrods. If it's not Harrods, it's boarding schools. If it's not that, it's the church. It's just relentless at the moment. But young people need to be protected above institutions, and therefore those in charge in a duty of care to them, this reasonable suspicion and known unsuspected. Also, I believe, reporting to the right place. A lot of what happened along the way in the sector that I understand, the boarding school sector, things were sometimes reported, but they were reported what I call like inwards and upwards. So you go to your line manager and go, I don't think, what so-and-so's doing with the kids at night, is okay. Okay, yeah, I'll look into that. It's very important. And of course, it would stop at a board, level or a senior leadership level, never go anywhere. But what we're talking about is straight outwards to the local authority designated officer, the LADO, or to the police. A teacher can just circumvent all of that hierarchy stuff, or I'm saying teacher, anyone in any profession can just get out to the right place. Is that your understanding?
That's what a good mandatory reporting law would do, and it's absolutely. I mean, you're right to raise that point. It's an absolutely crucial point, because in so many situations where people do report, and that does happen, then it goes up the chain internally, and somebody higher up makes the decision to kind of keep it hidden and not to report, and there are all sorts of spurious justifications that people can find not to do that. So you have to have a system that avoids that, and ultimately that means making the person who has the knowledge or suspicion the person who has the responsibility to do the reporting. And you can set up systems to support them in doing that, but that's where the responsibility has to rest, in my view. And that's what I think a good mandatory reporting law will do. But it's what you can't do. You can't sort of just introduce mandatory reporting in a vacuum. You've got to train staff. You've got to support them. You've got to have all of those things. And because what you want to do with this legal change is you want to embed a culture of reporting. You want to embed a culture where that becomes the norm. You don't actually want. I mean, we talked about the criminal penalty, and that's important to drive home the seriousness of this, but you don't actually want people ending up in jail. You don't want professionals ending up in jail for not reporting. You want people to do the right thing. Just as when you have a law requiring people to wear seatbelts, the object isn't to send people to jail for not wearing seatbelts. The object is to get everybody to wear seatbelts, which was exactly what was largely achieved. So that's the kind of analogy I think that we're looking for here.
Yeah, thank you. And I understand we've got mandatory reporting for money laundering, and have had for decades now. I remember it came in when I first started work. So we're protecting our money a little more than our children.
Well, that's exactly right. And I remember being long enough in the legal profession to remember when that was mooted, and before that came in, and there was a kind of uproar amongst certainly quite a lot of people in the legal profession who were like, this is really bad because we will have to breach client confidentiality and so on and so forth. There was all this uproar about it. It came in quite rightly, and now it's just something we do routinely. I know as a solicitor, if I reasonably suspect that a client is involved in money laundering, I have to report. I can't tell the client. I have to report that. There's a process for reporting. And if I don't report it, I can go to jail. And solicitors have gone to jail for that. And funnily enough, people do report, and it's become something that we do routinely. And I think and there has been a cultural change in the legal profession on that. And that's the kind of change that we need to see with the reporting of child sexual abuse, because as you rightly say, protecting children from abuse cannot be more important than money.
Yeah, thank you so much, Richard. Yeah, I was at an event on Monday night, Houses of Parliament, the Boarding on Insanity showing for MPs and things like that.
Yeah.
It was very much discussed in the Q&A afterwards. That we have to take the decision making out of this. If it's a criminal offence, if whistleblowers are protected, you don't have all that inner conflict, turmoil, priority. It's like, oh, hang on a minute, I could go to jail if I don't say something. This is getting done. Whatever the boss says or whatever the culture is, I'm going to report. To make something.
And I think sometimes, the trade union, the teaching unions, for example, have been worried that that this may result in false accusations and so on. But what they've got to keep in mind is that actually, if reporting is required, if it becomes mandatory, then the report becomes a neutral act. It doesn't, it doesn't imply that you're making a judgment about whether somebody's guilty or innocent. You're simply reporting what you know, and then it's for somebody external to investigate that. So it's actually, reporting becomes more of a neutral act actually if you make it mandatory.
Yeah. I've heard that. It's good because to me, I think many people listening, they'll go, well, A, I thought we had one anyway. B, I'm completely blown away we don't. And what's everyone still arguing about? Just get it done.
Yeah.
But you're right. Actually, a lot of very, good, hardworking professionals out there in social care and teaching unions, etc., are quite anti-mandatory reporting. A lot of others who manage things like, well, it's health services and things like that, are worried that suddenly there will be an enormous deluge of reports. All of them will be false and people will be sort of hounded out of their jobs and all this sort of stuff. But that's not borne out in any other country in the world where it's ever been introduced. And so it's just a bit of a red herring, if you like, that's kept this off the statute books for, Mandate Now. And those guys have been campaigning, 10, 15, 20 years?
Yeah, and I can't emphasize enough how much of an outlier, Britain has now become in not having this law. Most other Western countries, I think getting into 80-something%, have mandatory reporting laws. So it's the norm in most Western countries. It's becoming the norm even in less developed countries. I think the most recent country to introduce mandatory reporting is Saudi Arabia. Obviously, there'll be other issues there, and countries vary according to the extent to which they enforce any law that they have. But the principle is accepted, by most countries in the world now, and we are really, really kind of out of line with the rest of the world. Not just the sort of quote unquote civilized world, but the rest of the world in not having this. And as you say, if you went out into the street and asked people, people would be astonished, and people are astonished that we don't have this.
Yeah, thank you. We'll probably touch back on mandatory reporting later on, but obviously that's not the sole focus of where we are. But thank you, because I think it is critical and it's very present for reasons we'll come on to around ICSA and the implementation of the recommendations. But it's something you said there, when your first cases, Catholic Church, I think you mentioned. So going back to you a little bit, why abuse law, and why did you get into it, and now that you found your way in it, what have you seen? What have you been coming across?
Well, I think I was always, sort of going back to my background, I was always kind of motivated, as many people who go into law are, at least initially, by wanting to achieve justice for people. Strong sense of social justice, and I probably was always going to want to find an area of work where I could, both be trying to get justice for individuals, but also maybe campaigning for legal change as well, because of that, probably quite political background that I came from. And when I qualified as a lawyer, and I started out doing a sort of general kind of litigation and particularly personal injury work, and I didn't find it particularly interesting, if I'm honest. And there was a period when I was sort of fairly soon after qualification when I thought, do I want to carry on doing this? Do I want to stick with it? And then, purely by chance, I got instructed by a group of men and women who had been abused in care homes in North Wales, and there was a big public inquiry starting up in North Wales into all of that abuse in mainly state-run care homes. There were a few private ones as well, and I got involved in representing people in that inquiry. I was not long qualified actually when I started doing that. I was probably quite green. It was probably quite a steep learning curve, to be honest. My first kind of exposure to this type of work, but that inquiry went on, in fact, for 4 years, and I was driving, from Manchester, where I'm based, over to North Wales quite a lot, and going to the inquiry. That coincided with people starting to think about, could they bring legal action against organisations and institutions where abuse had occurred. That wasn't something that had ever really been done very much before. Part of the reason actually why lawyers started exploring that was because Michael Howard, who was the Home Secretary in the sort of mid to late 90s, he decided to abolish the old Criminal Injuries Compensation Authority. So that was a scheme that was relatively generous compared to what we have now. And in theory, at least, it made awards that were comparable to the awards that you can get in civil courts. But he decided to abolish that as a money-saving measure. And so lawyers started looking at, well, can we sue the institutions to get better compensation? And so I started getting involved in a bit of that. There were some cases on behalf of people who were abused in the North Wales care homes. And then I was contacted, I think this was in about 1997, by some men who'd been abused by a Catholic priest down in Surrey. A priest called Michael Hill, and he was a kind of career paedophile, and actually he had been the church had kind of moved him round from one parish to the next as he was, abused children, and then was discovered, and there were complaints by parents, and he was then moved to the next place. And the bishop who had actually been responsible for doing this, making these decisions to move him around, was a guy called Cormac Murphy O'Connor, who was at that time, when he was making these decisions, was Bishop of Arundel and Brighton. But I started the cases, and we actually sued Cormac Murphy O'Connor along with the Diocese of Arundel and Brighton. And in the course of the case, Cormac Murphy O'Connor was appointed to be Archbishop of Westminster, which is the kind of lead Roman Catholic bishop in the UK. So he effectively went from being a provincial bishop to being the head of the Roman Catholic Church in England and Wales, in effect. And the Catholic Church solicitors had sort of started this case by, refusing to compensate my clients and saying they were going to fight it all the way. And then when Cormac Murphy O'Connor was appointed to this much more senior role, suddenly they couldn't settle the case fast enough. It's like flip of a switch, and they were like, well, we're gonna settle this. And it was settled. And then there was a bit later on, there was quite a lot of publicity about it, and Cormac Murphy O'Connor actually nearly had to resign, although he sort of held on to his job and promised a whole sort of bunch of safeguarding reforms in the Catholic Church, some of which happened, some of which were less effective than he thought they might be. But as a result of that case, I then got involved in representing other victims of abuse in the Catholic Church and Church of England, quite a lot of religious cases, and then institutions. And in that period between the late 90s and probably the Jimmy Savile case, quite a lot of the cases involved care homes. There were big police investigations into care home abuse in sort of big urban centres, Liverpool, Birmingham, Sunderland, places like that. There weren't as many cases involving private schools. That those cases did happen from time to time. It was only really actually after the Jimmy Savile case, I think there was that sort of, big kind of national kind of discourse about child abuse suddenly that was in the media a lot for, a couple of years really. And then we started to see a lot more people coming forward from private school and boarding school backgrounds. There'd been some of that before, but there was a lot more of it after Savile. And so obviously, with the kind of expertise I built up, I started doing more of those cases as well.
Thank you for sharing your journey through it. And you mentioned almost straight off the bat, green into the profession, got involved in an inquiry, and that went on to be a theme. It was there in the intro when we read it out. But how after you navigated your way through that, how did you end up in the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, the ICSA inquiry in England and Wales, which was like 3 and a bit years ago? It finished, but it went on for a long time before that. And how did you get into it, and how was it for you as a process?
Well, I thought it was going to be important, and I thought it was an opportunity. It was the kind of opportunity that I had been looking for to build a case for legal change. Obviously, I'd done a lot of civil cases, with sued organisations and got compensation, got damages for people, but often those cases tended to be, if they were settled, they wouldn't end up in a courtroom, and a lot of the stuff that had gone on was not sort of it wouldn't be right to quite say it was covered up, but if a court process ends before you get to a trial, then it tends to attract less public interest. And so I was certainly very keen to find ways to build a case for change, particularly around mandatory reporting and things like that. And the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, I suppose it came about because of that huge kind of national discourse around abuse that happened, following Savile, but not just Savile. There were the grooming gang cases in places like Rochdale. I've been involved in some of those. So the inquiry was set up, and I remember being sort of quite surprised that the government had actually agreed to set it up in some ways, because it was quite a challenging thing to do, to have an inquiry that looks at institutional responses to abuse over a 50 or 60 year period and looks at multiple institutions. That is a very wide ranging inquiry. But it was an opportunity, as I saw it, to kind of build a case for legal change. And so I encouraged, where clients and former clients were willing to become involved, I encouraged them to do it, and to give evidence to it. And many of them did that, and, did so very bravely, because they, although they had anonymity in the process, they had to go into a hearing room and talk about very intimate things, often very distressing things that had happened to them in institutional settings. But I felt that it was, where clients wanted to do it and ex-clients wanted to do it, I felt that it was important to do, because it was an opportunity to build that case for change, which I think many of my clients have wanted to see.
Yeah, thank you. And just to, if you're listening and you were in that inquiry, you did an amazing job. I've spoken to many people who gave evidence, and it was harrowing. It was exhausting, and obviously now there is a real sense of some injustice in that 3 and a bit years on, nothing got done. The recommendations were pretty clear. Many argued some bits of evidence weren't fully taken on board. I appreciate that. That the recommendations could have been more far-reaching and could have gone further. That said, I understand all that. That said, there were 20. They were pretty clear, and they just haven't been done. It's been a sort of political football from the end of the last Conservative government through to the beginning of Labour, and but we'll come on to what's happening now. But yeah, that process was very far-reaching, and I think within that, the boarding school stuff really came through very strongly. And obviously, the journalist Alex Renton, he's done a great job of he's privately and confidentially with the abuse survivors, met with now thousands of them over the last 5-10 years. He's got a list, of 1,500, 2,000, complaints. Most of the independent schools in England are on that list. I've seen a redacted version of it without the people's names and without the details, just the names of the schools. And I would say between that and Everyone's Invited a few years ago, there are not many independent schools in Britain that aren't on that list. So it really, I think, if it did nothing else, it did start to blow the lid on just how widespread it was.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And they had, in fact, I think sort of, it was one module in ICSA for residential schools, but there was kind of two parts to it, and they looked at a whole range of institutions. It was, I think, difficult for many survivors for the reason, partly for the reasons you talked about, but also because different institutions got different levels of scrutiny. And if you take Ampleforth, for example, there was a 3-week hearing which looked at Ampleforth and Downside. That was fairly early on in the inquiry, and I represented some of the survivors of abuse from both schools in that. So that got 3 weeks, and then there were other independent schools where abuse had been just as serious. Where they got a day or half a day, or just a kind of mention in a written report. And so that was and I think for some of the people who participated, that felt quite random, and I think it probably was quite random in some ways, what got attention and what didn't. But you're right that overall, in terms of raising awareness about the sector, it was really important, and ample forth. I mean, that was one of the institutions that got kind of the highest level of scrutiny. Of course, has then been subjected to an ongoing process of scrutiny, quite rightly, an ongoing process of scrutiny since then, and they've only now just got to the point where they've got their safeguarding into the right shape. But that, I think, is an indication of how deep some of the problems were in the residential school sector.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, obviously we work with abuse survivors every day from boarding and independent schools, and it was hugely widespread internationally because often a lot of the time offenders were sent overseas to other schools and then came back, and yeah, my heart's with anyone.
Overseas and Scotland as well. There's traffic of abusers between Scotland and England.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I did a podcast recently with Kim and Tom from Mitchell.
Oh, yeah.
We were talking about the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry.
Yeah.
And of course, wonderful Giles Moffat, Alex Renton, Nikki Campbell, the Edinburgh Academy survivors, and that whole justice group. With thousands and thousands of young people were abused in Scottish schools, English schools all over the world. So, it's just a mention that it was so normalised. And that many people are coming to awareness of it now that we're getting a bit more trauma informed, or people are hitting middle age, or their parents are dying and there's no one left to protect anymore from the truth. Mental, physical health, bringing this stuff to the surface. There's so many reasons it doesn't always come out until later, but thankfully it is starting to move now. So speaking of sort of movement and things, ICSA happened. The final report, sort of November 3 years ago-ish, 20 recommendations. Don't have to remember them all, but mandatory reporting was one of them. Establishment of a child protection agency, changes to limitation laws around, how far back, because I think before people had to have made a complaint by their 21st birthday or something, or they were out of time. Could you just explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so, I mean, you mentioned before about it often taking abuse survivors, 20, 25, 30 years to report what happened to them. And so it's in the nature of abuse that it encourages people, it often forces people to stay silent out of shame and embarrassment. And so long delays in reporting abuse are inevitable. They're a function of the nature of the crime and the silencing impact of the crime. Now, if you're bringing a civil claim in this country, in theory, you have to bring it within 3 years of turning 18, because the time clock doesn't run against a child. But when you turn 18, you then, if you're dealing with something that happened when you were a child, then from the age of 18, the 3-year clock starts running, and you have 3 years. So you have to bring the claim in theory before you turn 21. The courts can allow a claim out of time in certain circumstances. It's important that people understand that. But limitation law has been what we call limitation law, which is the law of time limitations for bringing legal cases. That has been very unfair, and it has prevented people over the years, survivors, from bringing meritorious and genuine and justified claims. And so one of the things that ICSA recommended was that the 3-year time limit be abolished, that you don't have a time limit for claims. There would still be certain circumstances in which claims could be struck out if a fair trial was impossible, because if you're going to have a trial process, you have to be fair on the other side as well. But that was an important reform that was recommended by ICSA. I was one of the lawyers in the inquiry who advocated for it, and it's an important change. It's actually a change that has happened in many other jurisdictions. So if you go to Australia, the Australian Royal Commission recommended that sort of change, and that came in Australia. That change has come in Canada and in various other, New Zealand, various other
Scotland as well.
What we call common law jurisdictions, because they have a sort of historic connection with English law. So that change has come in. It's also come in America. Limitation laws have changed. So there's been this kind of international recognition that time limits can be very unfair for survivors of child abuse, child sexual abuse, and that needs to change. It actually already changed in Scotland, which is a different jurisdiction, back in 2017 after a political campaign there. So it's a really important change that ICSA has recommended. And like many of the changes that ICSA recommended, main recommendations, it's not yet been implemented.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. Thank you for explaining that. Yeah, the out of time thing, when I first heard about that, like a mandatory reporting, I couldn't believe that was a thing. Because what I know about, even cursory knowledge of sort of trauma and how things work, you're never going to get there at 21, really. It's very, very few. So thank you. And so we know there's 20 recommendations. I mean, there was, a year and a bit ago now, so this is early 26. There's a lot of stuff around Elon Musk and grooming gangs, and there was a big media flap, and the government really sort of came out strong about this time last year, really. Home Secretary came, right, we're doing all the ICSA recommendations. We know it's been 2 years, nothing much has happened, but this time we really mean it, we're going to do it. And there are some that are sort of technically in train, if you like. So there is a very watered down version of mandatory reporting in the Crime and Policing Bill, for instance. What's your take on any progress? And second part of the question is, why so little progress?
Well, I mean, what's happened since the ICSA report came out, which was in October 2022, and it came out, you may remember, on the day that Liz Truss resigned, so it got kind of overshadowed by that, which was very frustrating because a lot of survivors had given an awful lot and had shown a lot of courage in taking part in the inquiry and talking about the things that they had been through, which, as we talked about before. And what happened after that, I think, has been absolutely shameful and a complete betrayal of survivors, of all survivors, but particularly of those who went through the inquiry process. So when it came out, in effect, the then Conservative government did very little about it, very little to move the recommendations forward. And this is actually a chronic problem we have in this country, by the way. This is a bit of an aside, but this is a chronic problem we have in this country with public inquiries, that we have long and expensive public inquiries and the recommendations are then just left to sit on the shelf. And that is a big problem. It's a kind of British disease, and we really have to change that. But that's what's happened with ICSA. So the recommendations were made, Conservative government largely ignored them. I was a bit more hopeful when Labour came in that there would be more progress. I was partly hopeful because back in 2014, 2015, I had worked with Keir Starmer. This was just before he became an MP. And he was commissioned by Labour to do a kind of victims' law proposal. And one of the parts of that was actually recommending mandatory reporting. And I was heavily involved in writing that part of his report. And he seemed at that stage very committed to doing mandatory reporting and doing it properly. So Labour came in, and there was kind of radio silence. The kind of people expected that things would move forward, and really nothing very much happened. And the Labour government, didn't really kind of pick up on this and start to put anything into train until, as you say, there was this intervention by Elon Musk back in January of last year. January 2025, and I don't particularly like Elon Musk, and I think he's a very bad person in lots of ways. But I mean, it is a really sort of, it's a pretty sort of devastating comment on politicians and the British political system, and the way in which child abuse is not taken as seriously as it should be, that it takes someone like Elon Musk to intervene and generate, sufficient public debate and concern amongst politicians that they then decide that they've actually got to do something, and they suddenly remember, oh yeah, there's this ICSA report with these 20 recommendations, and we better be seen to be doing something about it. And they kind of pretended that, that had always been the intention, that they were going to do this. I'm not really sure that it was, but so Yvette Cooper then, who was Home Secretary at the time, then gave this commitment in the House of Commons that ICSA would be implemented. And I remember listening to that, to that speech in the House of Commons, and kind of as a lawyer recognising that she was giving herself some wriggle room in terms of what she was actually going to do. That she wanted this to come across as, yes, we'll implement ICSA, but actually in the wording there was some, it was sufficiently elastic that that it wasn't actually really a commitment to implement it or implement it fully. And what we've ended up with is a process where some of the recommendations have been taken, and pretty much all of them, I think without exception, that are being implemented have been watered down. Some of them have been watered down significantly. So you mentioned about mandatory reporting, and that's been, as you say, very much watered down. Even the limitation law proposal, which really ought to be very straightforward, and ICSA was very clear about what they wanted there. The current version, which the government are trying to put through Parliament, is a watered down version even of that. And I won't go into we don't have time to kind of go into the technicalities of how it's watered down and why, but it is watered down. There is work going on at the moment behind the scenes to try to get that back to what ICSA actually wanted. So there's that. The government are committed to introduce a child protection authority. And we'll have to see what that looks like. There's a consultation on that, and I would encourage people to respond to that. And I know you're keen that people do that. ICSA, I think this is one of the proposals that came out of ICSA where there was probably insufficient detail in the ICSA report as to what they envisaged a child protection authority would do and what powers that it would have. But certainly the version that ICSA have put forward wouldn't have enforcement powers, and I think that's a problem. So I think, if we do have a child protection authority, and I hope we do, I think that needs to be kind of strengthened. So there's that. There is, of course, also the recommendation from ICSA for a redress scheme for survivors, and the government have been pretty clear that that's not going to happen for reasons of cost. So
they've got one in Scotland, haven't they? A redress scheme.
Well, they've got one. That's exactly right. They've got one in Scotland, and ICSA was obviously an inquiry that only applied to England and Wales. So the recommendations only apply to that. But it has been a really, I think, shameful experience and shameful behaviour on the part of politicians that this very expensive inquiry, it cost, I think, £200 million over, and it ran for 7 years. There were promises at the beginning that what it recommended would be implemented into law, and that's not where we've ended up. We've ended up with some of the recommendations being taken forward, but in a very watered down form. And that, I think, is just completely unacceptable and is a really appalling betrayal of the survivors who took part in that process and went through something very, very difficult in the hope and belief and expectation that it would result in real change.
Thanks very much, Richard. And for any eagle-eyed viewers amongst you, you'll notice that Richard's got a slightly different background from this point on. Those listening won't have noticed. But we just picked up the conversation again as we ran out of time last time. And we hadn't got to one of the most important aspects around this, which is abuse survivors, their path to healing, path to justice, and getting Richard's take on that. So we've decided to, Richard's very kindly given us this time to jump back in, and so that we can give that the focus it deserves, because that's the key, is the human beings as part of this. So Richard, if someone has experienced abuse, we know it takes some 25, 30 years on average, particularly for child sexual abuse, but whether it's physical abuse, etc., starting to come into awareness for someone now. What are the steps that they can take? What would your advice be as someone who's worked with so many survivors?
Well, I think the first thing I'd say to anyone in that situation is you're not alone. It can feel very lonely, and that, of course, is why, one of the reasons why many people take so long to disclose that they feel that this happened to them, but it would be impossible or very difficult to describe that to other people or talk about it to other people. But there are people who can help. Organisations like Seen and Heard are actually a very good starting point, because you can start to shape that journey for people. It's important to remember, obviously, that a lot of abuse is criminal, and what happened to you, particularly if it involves sexual or physical abuse, could well be a criminal act. So it's important to think about reporting that to the police. And there's been quite a lot of negative publicity about the criminal justice system, and there are issues around it. But there are some good police officers. I've worked with some over the years, and there are specialist police officers who know how to deal with cases well. So it's important, if you've been the victim of a crime, to report that to the police. That's really important.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to look at the civil process, there are lawyers who can assist, but obviously a good starting point, like I say, is an organisation like Seen and Heard, because they can talk to you about the range of different things you can do. They can direct you to lawyers who can advise about the civil process, and those same lawyers may also be able to give you a steer about where to start the criminal process if that's what you want to do. So there's all those different things to think about. Therapy is incredibly important, and it's actually quite difficult to access at times, particularly on the NHS. So again, organisations in this space like Seen and Heard can help to give you a steer as to where you might be able to make a start at accessing the right kind of treatment.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. So what I'm hearing from you there is, get some support, wherever it might be, but some therapeutic support, and also just family members, whether you feel comfortable to share with those around you, so that you're not doing it alone. Many people who we've worked with who've really struggled through, let's say, a criminal or a civil process, have been a little bit isolated, from family members and support networks and therapists and things like that. And I'm right in saying, Richard, it's a tough process, isn't it? Whether it's criminal or civil, it's going to put you through the ringer.
Well, it can do, and of course, particularly so if it involves waiting for a criminal trial and then going through a criminal trial. That isn't necessarily what would happen. Of course, many people accused of abuse ultimately plead guilty, but if it involves going for a criminal trial, one of the problems at the moment is just how long it takes for that process, and it varies across the country. There is a bit of a kind of postcode lottery around this, but unfortunately, we have a criminal justice process that is far too slow at the moment, and that has to change. I mean, it's not kind of sustainable in its present form, with people waiting sometimes many years for a criminal process to conclude through a trial. So that's got to change, but it isn't uniformly like that. I mean, I do come across cases where criminal trials happen actually relatively quickly. So it's variable, but there are issues there, definitely. But it's also worth saying that if you do end up in a criminal trial, and you have to go through all of that, there are measures to protect victims in that situation. There's been a lot of improvement on that over the past decade or so. We have special measures to protect victims from having to see their abusers in court. We have what are called ground rules now to prevent oppressive questioning. And I'm getting a bit kind of legal and technical here, but I suppose the sort of headline point is that the system actually has become better and more victim-centred. It's still got a very, very long way to go, but there have been improvements, and that shouldn't be ignored as well.
Thank you, Richard. Yeah, thank you. And it's very important to say as well, I've of the hundreds of abuse survivors who I've worked with, spoken to over the last few years, they have found it difficult at times, but I haven't met one yet who said they wish they hadn't come forward, or they wish they hadn't started a process. There's moments during that journey where they think, God, what am I doing? Would it have been better not to? But once it's moved through, once they get some distance, whether it be the emotional healing side of things, the justice, being heard, being, this not being buried anymore, this not being shameful. And for most survivors that I speak to, they just want the record set straight. That a lot of the time they've been kind of shamed or gaslit, or made to feel like they were the only one, or it's not a big deal, or minimized, all that.
Mm.
They just want it, this was abuse, this was not okay, an apology, and getting the right sort of support. And particularly if it's an institution, they want the institution to learn the lessons and just not do it anymore. Yeah.
And I think that's absolutely right. And I think that some institutions are improving in their response to survivors. I mean, it's a slow process. Where I'm sitting, now with you in 2026, a lot of institutions have better processes for responding to survivors than they did, say, 15 or 20 years ago. But it's been a long process to get there, and it's far from kind of uniform across the range of institutions, and there are many that still respond, I'm afraid, in some cases appallingly, but in many cases just very unimaginatively, and make, I think, too little effort to put themselves in the survivor's shoes. But over time that's changing, and I think the work that you do, the educational work you do with institutions where you get the opportunity to do that is incredibly important, because that will benefit survivors, down the track.
Yeah, thank you, Richard, for mentioning that. And for anyone listening, Seen and Heard Schools, we go into institutions and try and instill a trauma-informed, victim-centred code of practice for ex-pupil well-being in the whole. So not just for those who've experienced abuse, but particularly handling non-recent disclosures of abuse, because there is a human way to do it. But when the institution protects reputation, lawyers goes adversarial straight away, refuses to apologise, because I'm right in saying that if you apologise, it's no admission of liability. You can just say, that is awful, that should never have happened to you, we unreservedly apologise. But most don't. They don't. They kind of obfuscate, drag things out, ask a lot of very detailed questions of the person to almost sort of refute it, get them questioning, did they actually experience it? So really, really sort of poor form, really poor stuff that I see out there.
Yeah, there's absolutely far too much of that still, and you're absolutely right. Institutions can apologise, and that doesn't mean that they then make themselves legally liable. So there are ways through this for them if they want to be imaginative and they want to support survivors. And the best institutions that I've dealt with will think proactively about how they can provide funding for therapy and that kind, those kinds of things. Not always necessarily what the survivor wants to have, to have the institution do that, but at least if that can be offered, that's a step that can be taken. So there are lots of things actually that institutions can do, and I wish that there was a way of getting more of them to do it, to be honest, because I see some good practice, I see quite a lot of poor practice.
Yeah, thank you. We're working with one of Scotland's largest independent schools at the moment to write them some good policies, practices, and they've done that proactively. They're not one of the ones, as we're speaking in February 2026, FETIs are all over the papers at the moment for very, very poor handling of abuse survivors. They've been absolutely pulled apart in the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry. And they would be, we know sadly there's many of those who've got it really, really wrong. So I do honour the ones who are stepping forward. There's only a few of them at the moment, but we've got the end of February 26. We've got a presentation to the Boarding School Association about this subject. So the fact that we're even kind of allowed in the door there, given what we do, I believe it means the schools are starting to take this more seriously. Finally. So for anyone listening who's think, well, something happened, I don't want to come forward, the school will do X, they've heard all the horror stories. I would just say it's nowhere near perfect, but there is a bit of a shift. I can feel it. And what's you see a lot more of this than I do. What's your gut about where we're going and where we're at the moment?
I think there is a gradual shift, and I think there's a number of. I mean, if I'm completely honest about it, I think there's a number of different things going on. I think that obviously, as institutions move forward in time, a new generation of people comes into running those institutions, and they, in many cases, are a bit more enlightened. a bit more aware of abuse as an issue. So, there's genuine sort of evidence of enlightenment, as it were, kind of coming into institutions, and that is fostered and really, promoted by organisations like yours. I think the other factor is that particularly the independent school sector is under a bit of stress at the moment, a bit of economic stress. School rolls are falling, VAT on school fees, those kinds of things. And I think, what that means is that, the sort of, I suppose in a sense, the positive side of that is that institutions are more conscious of the need to promote and protect their reputation and do that in the right way, not by covering things up, but by being seen to, to deal with survivors in the right way. So there is a degree of self-interest about this in what is, I think at times at the moment, for many independent schools, quite a difficult market. So there is a degree of self-interest about how they respond to this, but equally, there is also some enlightenment creeping in. So I think there's a mixture of things going on, if I'm honest. But where there are these sort of economic pressures, in a sense, that are, forcing schools to show that they are, doing better on this kind of thing, then, that's got to be good. And we've got to kind of take advantage of that and push and prod them in the right direction, and also give them the information and, the knowledge base to do that, which is obviously what you're trying to do.
Thank you, Richard. That's really clear. Yeah, there are a lot of factors here. And I know, I hear it a lot from advocates saying, but they're only doing this to protect their reputation. And I say, yeah, but I sort of don't care why they're changing. I only care that they're changing. I'd love it if it was for enlightenment reasons and truly benevolent reasons, but I'll take what I can get. And if someone walks me through the door, then I know once I'm in front of people, I can, hearts and minds, because human beings are inherently decent. Institutions, however, are inherently corrupt and power structured.
Yeah,
so if you can get to the heart of a human being, they start to change amongst themselves. It's a hearts and minds job, but the institution itself largely is set up to protect its own neck. So,
and I think that when we come to the issue of reputation, we were talking before it, when we talked about mandatory reporting, about this compulsion and desire to protect reputation that was done in the past by covering up bad things. And what we've got to get institutions to understand is that you can try and cover up bad things, but you can never actually ultimately succeed in doing that. Those things will come to light at some point, and ultimately it will be more reputationally damaging to try and do the cover up. The much better way is to be open about the bad things, and to address them head on, to be honest about it, and to look at ways in which you can improve, the way in which your institution operates. And I think, what we want to see is that kind of cultural shift where people recognise that ultimately trying to protect reputation by covering things up is ultimately self-defeating. It just always is. And I can tell you, as a lawyer who's been doing cases for a few decades now, that it always ends badly. It's always just better to be honest and honest early on.
Yeah, that's so powerful. The transparency culture that we need, the accountability and transparency culture. We have a strap line with these schools, which is own your past, safeguard your future. It basically means if you're willing to own the things that have happened, truly own them and make the changes that are necessary, make the apologies, make the reparations, you've got half a chance of moving forward. If you don't, you will be gone at some point. And I'm that firm with them. And we've been around for generations. So the world's changing. So it may have worked before, but it's not gonna fly going forward. And parents now are much more enlightened about where they want their young people to be. The majority, I believe, would far rather a school proactively communicate, look, we've had a non-recent case, this is what we're doing about it, we're letting everybody know, we're reaching out to alumni and saying, this case has been there, if you've been affected, please come forward, please speak to us. that's gold standard. If anyone needs support, we have, so and so we're working with for support. It's not that hard. It's just human being stuff. But by Christ, some of them don't want to know that. They're like, but the parents will be running away from the school in their droves because no, they'd be coming towards you because you're modelling the kind of values that they want their children to have in the main.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I always tried to make a point in ICSA, the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse, when we had the, for example, the residential schools hearings, where it was obvious that institutions had really tried to respond well and had tried to, be open and honest about things that had gone wrong in the past. I always made a point of trying to praise them because I think that, as well as being very critical of institutions, as I have been over the years and as you have been, we also want to, encourage and in a sense, reward and praise good practice.
Yeah, definitely. Absolutely. And I think what's important to say at this point is when we speak to schools, the biggest insurer, Ecclesiastical, has a big policy on victim-centred code of practice, on saying sorry, on doing the right things. British Institute of Insurers has the same thing. So actually, even the sort of, the ones you'd expect to perhaps see things differently, they're actually saying, no. They've done the maths on this. They've worked out it's cheaper and better for people to face in to it and treat people humanely than to obfuscate and hide. So, if they're saying it, I do think it's time for schools to listen. So thank you. So as we sort of bring things to a close, if anyone, any final thoughts, any final words, Richard, for anyone, if someone's at home, they're coming to that point where they know something happened that was not right at all. Do you have any final thoughts, any words for them from your experience?
I think that just the single biggest thing that I want to convey, and we touched on this before, but I just really want to convey that to anybody in that situation, you are not alone, and you will, and many people will have had an enormous sense of carrying a huge burden and of doing so in silence and of not being able to talk about it. But there are many people out there who can help you and can support you through a journey that can get you to a better place. An organisation like Seen and Heard is a very good sort of place to start on that journey. But there are lots of resources there that can help you move forward. So don't try to shoulder that burden alone. Do speak to people who can help.
Beautiful, powerful words, Richard. Thank you so much, and thank you for coming back on to finish this off. I want to really honour your work. I mean, we've worked together for a couple of years now. You do a brilliant job, and the thing that I get the most from you is there's a genuine warmth, a genuine care for the people, your clients, the people you work with, and for everything you put into ICSA and continue to when you write, newspaper articles, and you're always trying to make things better. You're trying to get the system to sort of sort itself out. So thank you for your work.
Well, thank you. Real pleasure to talk to you.
Beautiful. And thank you for listening. It's been the Seen and Heard podcast, a conversational series. I'm Chris Braitch. I've been with Richard Scorer, the lawyer, today. And thank you for taking your time. And please do take some of these things forward with you, whether it's opening up conversations with those who've been affected by what we've spoken about today, challenging institutions around what they're doing and how they're handling things, or mandatory reporting and the ICSA recommendations and things like that. Please do take up the mantle, because I can feel things moving and we need more people to support. So we'll say goodbye, Richard. Thank you for today.
Thank you.
Cool. And goodbye to everyone. Sorry, were you going to say something?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I hope there wasn't too much noise in the background. My wife, my daughter, stepdaughter, decided to have a very loud conversation. I don't know if you could hear it, but
we didn't hear it. But that's lovely.
Oh, great. Okay, that's good.
Yeah. We'll send them our love, and we'll finish today. Thank you for listening, everybody. We'll see you on the next one.
Okie doke. Take care. Bye.